Even the most carefully planned murders can unravel when details are overlooked. But in the case we're discussing today, one person said the details weren't missed. They were intentional in order to frame him. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to Crime Lines. When you hear this episode, I will be packing for the Studio Both And opening in North Adams, Massachusetts, and I'm looking forward to everyone who's planning on being there. Somehow I have to manage a panel that includes both Justin from Generation Y and Amanda from Wine and Crime, and if you know them, you know that's a lot of personality, but it's going to be a great time. Next week is my scheduled week off, but I always release a bonus episode that week on Patreon and Apple subscriptions, so check those out if you're interested in ad-free content and extra episodes. And if that isn't enough, go check out my new podcast, Crime Lines and Consequences. In September, we released an episode on Sylvia Browne and her psychic predictions related to missing persons cases, as well as an episode with LA Not So Confidential on the research into the incel community and risk assessment within that group. When people are engaging in violent rhetoric online, it doesn't mean they're going to turn violent. So what do we know about incels that could help with that risk assessment? But before you go listen to any of those things, listen to this episode first. We're going to start with the Rideout family, who were at the center of this case. In January of 1993, Craig and Laura Rideout married at the ages of 26 and 21, respectively. Over the next 20 years, their family grew to include 7 children, 3 girls and 4 boys. The older 6 were all born close in age, roughly every 2 years, and then there was a gap of about 6 years before they had one more baby. The family lived in Pittsford, New York, which is a suburb of Rochester. Laura stayed at home with their large family, while Craig worked in IT. As he was the sole income for such a large family, Craig worked a lot to make ends meet, though he also remained active as a volunteer with the Boy Scouts and also the church youth group. For many years, Laura and Craig were happy, but cracks started showing after the first decade or so of marriage. The lack of time together, managing a big family, and financial issues strained their relationship. There would also later be accusations of verbal abuse from Craig towards Laura, which came from Laura but was also backed up by at least one of the children. Craig had an old friend from his single days named Paul Tucci, who went by PJ. And PJ also worked in the tech field. He got married. He and his wife also had a large family, not quite 7 kids, but they had 4. And the 2 families became close. They were almost like extended family to each other. In 2014, PJ's wife died of liver failure at the age of 44. And through her illness, he had leaned on Laura and Craig for support. And Laura leaned back on PJ as her relationship with Craig was strained to its breaking point. Through this, the two eventually started a relationship, and that's kind of how the story has been told in most of the overview accounts of the case. So I had this idea in my head that PJ's wife died, and over the next few months, he and Laura ended up falling for each other. But according to court documents, PJ's wife died in August of 2014, and Laura left Craig and moved in with PJ the following month, taking their 4 minor children with her. So PJ's wife dying and Laura moving in happened in quick succession. And then in November of 2014, Laura filed for divorce from Craig. At the time of their separation, 3 of Laura and Craig's children were adults and not subject to any custody battle. Their oldest, Colin, was a student at SUNY Maritime College with plans to enlist in the Navy, but he ended up dropping out of school just 2 years in. In part, this was so that he could come home and help his mother. Based on what family friends have said, he was always a huge helping hand in the regular care of his younger siblings. And that's likely because Craig worked so much and Laura was, according to Colin, a bit flaky and also dealt with debilitating migraines. The 4 minor children who were subject to any custody order then found themselves in the middle of their parents as they both battled for full custody. Over the next year and a half, there were multiple hearings and orders issued, with Craig eventually being given temporary custody of all 4 children. The two had the final custody hearing scheduled for January 26, 2016, when a judge would hear both sides and make what was hopefully the final determination of custody. Just a few days before the hearing, all 4 kids were at Craig's house when there was an incident. The 2 teen daughters locked themselves and the younger 2 children, who were about 12 and 6 at the time, into a bedroom, and they refused to come out. The police came to the house and tried to talk them into opening the door, which they initially refused to do. When they finally did get the door opened and the kids out, one of the teen daughters, who was seen as the instigator of the situation, was taken into custody for a mental health evaluation. The custody hearing then occurred as scheduled in spite of this incident, and in early February, the judge gave a ruling. The older 2 minor children were old enough to decide where they wanted to go, and they chose Laura. So she was given primary custody of them. The other 2, who were under the age of 13, were placed in Craig's primary custody, with Laura given a visitation schedule. The 2 parents were also ordered to only have curbside exchange. That meant the parent driving was not allowed to get out of the car when they dropped the kids off or picked them up. And I always hate seeing things like this in custody orders, because the ideal situation for kids is to see their parents being pleasant with each other during custody exchanges. But apparently Laura and Craig couldn't even be civil, to the point that it was better that the children never see them interact at all. In May of 2016, the divorce was still not final, though it looked like the custody had been settled. But then Craig accused Laura of violating their order. His attorney filed an order to show cause and then an application for contempt proceedings against Laura. They were asking that Laura be given supervised visits only. And a hearing for these filings was scheduled for July 26, 2016. A week and a half before this hearing, Craig called the police to report a break-in at the townhouse he had recently moved into. It had occurred in the overnight hours on July 13th going into the 14th, and Craig sounded hesitant on the phone to even report it. And the reason for that was that he believed that his oldest son, Colin, was somehow behind it. What happened was that Craig was asleep in his room and woke up to a sharp pain on his arm. All he saw was a person in black, then fleeing the room. He believed the pain had come from someone pulling his arm hair out. The intruder was gone out of the house before Craig fully woke up. He then realized that his townhouse keys and his work cell phone were missing. The keys were later found in a neighbor's flower pot, and Craig also found, strangely enough, a bottle of chocolate out in his front yard. But the stolen phone was the real reason Craig decided to report this to the authorities. It doesn't sound like he pointed the finger at Colin to the investigators. However, he told others he thought Colin was behind it, and he characterized it as a bizarre prank. Over the next couple of days, Craig and Colin exchanged a couple of emails about the situation, with Craig making it clear that he loved Colin, was proud of him, and wanted to mend fences. He said he hoped they could have a relationship independent of the situation with Laura. Colin did not sound interested in this at all, both the reconciliation and having a conversation outside the context of the divorce. It seemed the only thing Colin cared about was the divorce and custody battle. Colin said that after they moved in with PJ, he realized that his father had been abusive over the years. He accused Craig of constant lying and attempting to control the family by dragging out the divorce and this custody battle. He called Craig's behavior during the divorce despicable and said if he had any decency, he'd let the younger two go live with Laura, who was planning to move out of state. Craig had told his sister Robin that he intended to carry himself with dignity and grace during the divorce, and he loved his children very much. I think we see this in the email exchange where he's expressing love for a son who was definitely taking his mother's side in things. Nothing in this email exchange that happened in the days after the break-in resolved anything. On Tuesday, July 19th, after these emails and about a week before the next custody hearing, Craig talked to his sister Robin on the phone around 7:30 that night. Laura had dropped the younger two kids, ages 6 and 12, off at Craig's house at the end of her parenting time, and Craig talked to Robin frequently, just as he was dealing with the stress of the situation. The next day, Robin tried to call Craig in the morning, and he didn't answer his phone. A few hours went by, and Craig hadn't responded to any call or text, so on her lunch break, Robin swung by his townhouse, getting there around 1 p.m. When she got there, she was let in through the back door by Laura Rideout. Laura said she didn't think it would be long before someone came looking for Craig, and she didn't know where he was either. All she knew was that their 12-year-old had texted her in the morning saying that Craig wasn't there, and they didn't know where he went. His minivan was gone as well. Laura said she went over to the house to see what was going on and said her 6-year-old was sick, so she had Colin come pick up the younger kids just about 10 minutes before Robin got there. She said she noticed the kitchen was dirty and smelled a bit, so she decided to clean it before leaving herself. Robin thought this was all incredibly odd. Why was Laura, who wasn't even allowed to get out of the car when she dropped the kids off, inside Craig's house, let alone cleaning up as some favor to him? Laura finished up whatever she was doing there and left carrying her own purse, a white trash bag, and an empty black trash bag. Robin looked around the main floors of the house, didn't see anything out of place, and then went to Craig's bedroom. The door was locked and no one answered when she knocked, so concerned, she called 911 at around 2:15. Robin said on the 911 call that she was afraid she was making a mountain out of a molehill, but things just didn't seem right. The police showed up and looked around the outside of the house and didn't see anything immediately suspicious. And because there wasn't anything too alarming, they didn't have the probable cause they needed to go into Craig's house without a warrant. While the police were at the house, Laura showed up and she told them that Craig was definitely there when the kids were dropped off the night before, and she allowed the police to speak to the two kids, who also confirmed that Craig was home the night before, and they didn't notice anything strange. The 6-year-old said that Craig was playing a game on the computer when she went to bed, and then the 12-year-old said that Craig himself went to bed around 11 or 11:30. Craig was not home when they woke up, and the older one thought he must have gone to work, but when they didn't hear anything from him, they reached out to their mom. Having gathered the basic information that no one had heard from Craig since 11 or 11:30 the night before, the police were able to get a warrant that evening. They were able to not just search the house, but also force open the bedroom door. Inside the bedroom, they found absolutely nothing amiss, which was at first a relief. Obviously, there was a fear that maybe Craig had a medical emergency in a locked room. They continued the search of the house and went down to the basement. One side of the basement was organized, but the other looked more like a general storage area and was a bit messy. Over in that area, an officer noticed what looked like blood on a broken down cardboard box. And once they started looking closer, they found more blood on the floor. This was just a small amount, like spatter or droplets, so they decided to use luminol to see if there was more there, and there absolutely was. There was clearly an attempt to clean up blood off the floor. off of a plastic storage bin, a wooden shelving unit, and the wall. In that same area with the blood was a black trash bag, which further confirmed that there had been a cleanup. Inside that bag were bloody paper towels and a work glove with blood on it. But worst of all, in that same trash bag was a homemade garrote with 2 handles and a cord between them, and it also had blood on it. At this point, the missing persons case turned into a possible homicide. Robin was waiting outside while the police were searching, waiting on some news. She didn't hear anything until a violent crime advocate came over, and she was told they believed her brother, 50-year-old Craig Rideout, had been killed overnight, which would have been while the kids were sleeping in the house. But they let her know that his body had not been found inside his home. It turned out, though they didn't know it at the time, Craig's body had been found very early that morning, before Robin even went looking for him. A farmer in Jerusalem, New York, which is a little more than an hour south of Craig's home, was out riding his bike when he saw what looked like blood in the grass. He walked into the woods to see what was going on, and just about 50 feet from the road, he saw a large brown tarp wrapped up and secured with bungee cords. He looked under the tarp and saw a body. He called 911 and the investigators came out to the scene. Craig hadn't been reported missing yet, so they didn't immediately connect the cases. And unfortunately, the identity of the body was hard to tell because someone had poured some type of caustic chemical on the face. As the investigators were at the scene, they heard a cell phone ring. They looked at each other, waiting on someone to answer their phone, but it wasn't any of theirs. It was coming from the pocket of the dead man. It turned out it was someone who was calling Craig, looking for him. From what I've gathered, they didn't touch the phone as they were still processing the scene at the time. But then when Craig was reported missing, the police on that side of the case pinged his phone and learned his location was an hour south of his home. So it ended up not taking long at all for the 2 investigating agencies to connect the missing man to the John Doe thanks to this cell phone. They opted, however, not to announce the connection until they had confirmation done, which was done 2 days later through dental records. Now, near the road, not far from the body, they found a flathead shovel, and there were signs that someone had tried to dig. It looked like an attempt to bury the body, but the shovel, not being pointed, couldn't get through the dense soil, and the plan to bury the body was abandoned, along with the shovel. They also found in the tarp small round pieces of plastic. These were super thin, like the seals they put on bottles, so the investigators wondered if these were the seals from whatever bottle of acidic product was used to disfigure Craig's face. On autopsy, the medical examiner ruled that the cause of death was asphyxiation and blunt force trauma. Obviously, Laura was an immediate suspect. She was not only the estranged wife with a week before a custody hearing, she was found at the house, which was the crime scene, cleaning up. And while the police were there, she showed back up. So was she there to try to finish the cleanup job she started before Robin got there? But the investigators obviously needed more than a suspicion, and Robin gave them the first potential lead when she told the police that Craig had a hidden camera in the house. He set it up after the earlier break-in, and it looked like a clock, so no one would have suspected it. The investigators pulled the SD card from the camera and found that it was full, and unfortunately, it had stopped recording the night of the murder. It wasn't set up to override older recordings, so when it had filled up, it just stopped. But other cameras would help solve this crime, several of them in fact. And the first camera footage found actually started with cell phone pings. So Craig's phone was on his body, and checking his phone's history, It left his townhouse around 3:15 in the morning on July 20th, about 4 hours after his son last saw him heading to bed. Based on a couple other pings, they mapped the most likely route between his home and the dump site. They found 6 different businesses along the 50-mile path that had security cameras that faced the road, and so they pulled the footage from 3 a.m. forward. There were not a lot of cars traveling that early in the morning, so it was a lot of watching nothing. But then, as they're viewing this empty road, they saw a minivan consistent with Craig's driving down the road toward the dump site, with a dark-colored sedan right behind it. These 2 vehicles were together every single time they showed up on camera for 50 miles. And then, as the police kept watching the footage to see if the vehicles came back through, they did, and again they were together. This told the investigators that at least 2 people were involved. The next CCTV footage came courtesy of that shovel found at the scene. It still had the UPC sticker on it, so they were able to scan it and learn that it was sold at the Walmart closest to Craig's house around midnight the night of the murder, and the person buying the shovel paid with cash. Walmart security cameras in 2016 were numerous and with clear pictures. So they pulled the footage from the front of the store, inside the aisles, and at the checkout. They saw a dark sedan pull up to Walmart, similar to the car seen following Craig's minivan. A man got out of the rear passenger seat and went inside. The camera from inside the store made it very clear who this was. It was Craig and Laura's oldest son, Colin. The investigators saw Colin Rideout go through the store and then up to the checkout to pay for the shovel, along with 4 sets of work gloves. When he exited the store, the dark sedan picked him up, and it was clear there were already 3 other people in the car. Unfortunately, it was not clear who they were, even with an attempt at enhancing the video. But now we have 4 people in the car and 4 sets of work gloves at the same time that shovel was bought, so we went from 1 to 2 to now 4 people suspected of participating in this crime. And then the next major lead came the day after Craig was reported missing, and it gave the first clue as to who at least one of the people with Colin was at that Walmart. The police were called out to Mendon Ponds Park, which is just south of Rochester. A woman called 911 after she saw 2 young men at the park. One of them had medical gloves on, and he took them off, wrapped them in something, and put them in the car trunk. She then saw him walking down a trail that led to a pond called Devil's Bathtub, and he was carrying a trash bag. This was kind of over-the-top suspicious, so she took a picture of the license plate and then called the police. The police got there before the 2 men had left and found that one of them was Alex Rideout, one of Craig and Laura's adult sons. He was sitting alone in the car and clearly in some kind of distress. According to the responding officer, he had his head in his hands and was rocking back and forth. Soon after they arrived, they saw Colin Rideout walking up the trail from the Devil's Bathtub pond. The investigators approached Alex and Colin and talked to them, and they had pulled out an iPhone to covertly record the conversation. Initially, the boys said they were just at the park walking around and I guess enjoying nature. They were asked directly about their missing father, and Colin said he was concerned about Craig because Craig had been acting strangely lately. And Alex said he assumed Craig had just left the family and had been on the next flight to Mexico. Now, you have to remember that the police held back that they suspected Craig's body had been found the day before, and that holdback information included keeping it from the family. So Colin and Alex likely didn't know about it when Alex was trying to paint this picture that Colin may have fled to Mexico. Colin and Alex were both detained at the scene, and the police went down to the pond. There they saw a black trash bag floating in the water. They also searched the car and found a second trash bag in the trunk. The detective told Colin it would be best for him if he told them what was in the bag before they found out for themselves, and he said he didn't know. Colin was pushed a bit and ended up admitting that he was at their dad's house with their mother and younger sister cleaning up blood in the basement. He didn't know what happened to his dad, but he was worried based on what he saw at the townhouse. He said it was their mother Laura who had given them the bags to dispose of. Both Colin and Alex were then put in a patrol car, and Alex was shaking at this point. They were then taken to the station while the park and their car was searched for additional evidence. Inside those trash bags were bloody clothes, Craig's wallet, keys to his townhouse, and 4 bottles of drain cleaner, as well as bloody gloves. Drain cleaner, by the way, is caustic enough to cause the damage they saw on Craig's face. In a duffel bag in the back seat were a box of medical gloves and a paracord consistent with the homemade garrote found in the bag in the basement. Alex and Colin were then charged with tampering with evidence, and partly based on Colin's statement that their mother Laura had told them to throw the bags away and to clean up the basement, Laura was also arrested later that day. She was charged with both tampering with evidence and burglary for having gone into Craig's house when she was, based on a court order, not even supposed to exit her car during drop-offs. With the arrest of Laura came a search of her house where they found the keys to Craig's minivan, which had not been recovered yet, and blue tape similar to what was used to make the garrote. They also found bungee cords consistent with what was used to wrap Craig's body up. Laura bailed out almost immediately, but it would be another few days before the boys could. Around the same time Alex and Colin were bailed out, Craig's minivan was found at a park and ride. Meanwhile, the investigators were using the same process that found the security camera footage of Colin Rideout buying the shovel to figure out who bought those bottles of drain cleaner believed to have been used to disfigure Craig's body. And that process was as simple as scanning the UPC label. 2 of these bottles turned out to have been bought at the same Walmart as the shovel, but they were bought the night before, around 8 p.m. on July 18th. These 2 bottles were sold to Colin Rideout, who again paid with cash. So the investigators backed up the footage to see when he arrived at the Walmart, and though he was alone at the checkout when he bought the items, he hadn't entered the store alone. With him was one of his teenage sisters and their mother, Laura. When he left the store, he was alone, but Laura and his sister left shortly after him. The other bottles of drain cleaner brought them to a different Walmart on the night of July 19th between 9 and 10 p.m. Cameras showed Laura Rideout and her boyfriend, PJ Tucci, entering the store together. The investigators watched as they made their way through the store to the aisle with the tarps. They then looked at various tarps before choosing one that was the same size, color, and brand as the one found with Craig's body. Now, when they checked out, they purchased that tarp, bungee cords, bug spray, more of the drain cleaner, and a Diet Coke. They left around 10 p.m., and 2.5 hours later was when Colin bought that shovel. So just to recap, the order of the purchases was, on July 18th, Colin bought the drain cleaner while with his mother. She was seen putting the items in the cart and then separating from Colin for the rest of the shopping trip. The next night, on July 19th, Laura and PJ bought the tarp, bungee cords, and more drain cleaner. Both of these purchases happened while Craig was still alive, according to his 12-year-old son, who was home with him. Then, at about 12:30 a.m., Colin bought the shovel. It's not known if Craig was still alive at this point or not, but he probably was. And I say that because the clothing Colin was seen wearing in the Walmart security video was identical to what was found bloody in the bag in the trunk of his car. It's unlikely he walked through Walmart in bloody clothes. These purchases, if made before Craig was killed, means the murder was premeditated. That said, there is an alternative theory out there that Craig was killed prior to the purchase of the tarp, and that purchase was made simply as a cover-up for an impulsive murder, not a premeditated one. But for that to be true, the 12-year-old and possibly even the 6-year-old would have been instructed to lie to the police when saying that Craig was alive after dinner until he went to bed around 11 or 11:30. Not that the story isn't already disturbing enough, but involving 2 young children in a cover-up would make it much worse in my view. 2 months after the murder, based largely on the Walmart security footage, PJ Tucci was also arrested and charged with tampering with evidence, but no one had yet been charged with murder. The police were waiting on DNA results on some of the evidence. There was blood in the house on various pieces of clothing and work gloves, but they had to make sure it was Craig's blood. Colin and Alex's DNA was easily obtained because when they were arrested on that tampering charge, the police brought them to lunch and preserved their straws. But Laura and PJ wouldn't submit to DNA swabs until the judge ordered them to. In both cases, the judge ruled there was probable cause, and in Laura's case specifically, this ruling was because female DNA had been found on a Diet Coke bottle found in Craig's basement. And Laura had bought a Diet Coke that night when she and PJ bought the tarp and bungee cords. The DNA results were pretty damning. They showed that Colin and Laura both had Craig's blood on their clothing. The DNA from the Diet Coke bottle in the basement matched Laura. Alex's DNA was also found on clothing that was found in the basement. DNA from all 4 pairs of gloves showed Craig's blood was on them, and swabs from the inside of 3 pairs matched Laura, PJ, and Alex. The testing from the 4th pair did not detect Colin's DNA profile as they expected, but that was possibly because there was too much blood from a direct relative to then separate out Colin's touch DNA. The police theory of the crime was that all 4 of them participated in the entire thing. The planning of the murder, the execution of the plan, and then the cover-up. The investigators believed that it was likely after the younger 2 kids were in bed that someone lured Craig into the basement. Given his desire to reconcile with his adult children, it wouldn't have been difficult for either Colin or Alex to have managed to get him down there without raising his defenses. Once downstairs, Craig was ambushed with the garrote, but fought back and was bashed on the head in an attempt to subdue him. That much blood at the scene was not part of the plan, so the cleanup of the basement was rushed at the last minute. But according to the police theory, these 4 had planned for the other parts of the cover-up. The tarp and the bungee cords to wrap the body in, the drain cleaner to hide his identity, and the shovel to bury Craig Rideout where they hoped he would not be found. After they transported Craig's body to the dump site, they realized they brought the wrong type of shovel to dig easily, and they pivoted to just leaving him there, which meant he was found within a few hours. All or some of the 4 went back to the house and started cleaning up the scene, with Laura being interrupted by Robin before she could get all of the evidence out of the house. The bag with the garrote and the gloves may have disappeared from the house if Robin had gotten there even 10 minutes later than she did. But as much as it looked like this crime was carefully planned out, they had missed key details. They left the shovel at the scene with a UPC tag on it. They paid cash, which avoided a paper trail, but they didn't consider the cameras. And Laura left her Diet Coke in the basement. Though the state didn't know who had strangled Craig and who had hit him in the head, they believed that all 4 had been involved in the plot and were equally as culpable as the next. The evidence, along with a motive, was presented to the grand jury. And the motive, of course, went back to that 20-month-long custody battle. Laura had tried to get custody through the courts the usual way, but it didn't go her way initially. Craig ended up with temporary custody of all 4 children. So when the final custody hearing was approaching in January, Laura decided to try to get custody back by accusing Craig of abuse, but she wanted proof of it. To get that, she tried to set Craig up. Remember how prior to that final custody hearing, their daughters had locked themselves and their siblings in a room together and they refused to come out? Well, it turned out that wasn't just a moment of teenage angst or the effects of a spontaneous fight. It was planned. They had been recording the whole thing on a cell phone, hoping to catch Craig screaming and yelling at them. Based on text messages between the girls and Colin, the goal was to push Craig into losing his temper on them, and then they would report it as abuse. Laura texted Colin about this, but Colin was the one communicating directly with the kids in the house. Colin gave them very specific instructions on what to do and what to say, even texting that they should call the police before Craig even got home and say that they were afraid he was going to kill their younger siblings when he got home. Colin also told them that if Craig started screaming at any point, they should call 911 because the recording of him in the background would, quote, play well in court. When the plan was put into action, one of the teen sisters barricaded in the room, texted Colin that they were in there, and Colin then told her to delete all of the text from Laura off of the phone and tell the police they were being abused by their father. But then Craig didn't fly off the handle. He didn't start screaming. Much to the dismay of Laura and Colin, he didn't turn abusive towards the children. When one of the sisters expressed in a text that she was worried they would be in trouble for holding the younger 2 against their will, Colin told her to stay in the room until the police understood the situation. Colin also texted the 12-year-old that he was going to get stuck with their dad for 8 more years and not be allowed to see their mother if he didn't do something. Colin was basically trying to pressure them into claiming abuse when they failed at manufacturing it. Based on texts between Laura and Colin, it sounds like Laura was blaming one of the teen girls for the plan not working and told Colin to knock some sense into her. She said she would be screwed if the daughter talked to the attorney representing the children's best interests about everything because Laura had already been chastised for speaking poorly of Craig to the kids. Laura then said some frankly disgusting things about her own child, calling her words I will not repeat, all because she didn't manage to frame her father for abuse. Colin suggested Laura turn his sister's phone off for 48 hours and she would, quote, break. The plan ultimately failed, and Laura did not have a video of Craig screaming at the kids to play in court. She only got custody of the 2 teen girls because the judge gave them the ultimate say-so on where they wanted to live, and Craig retained custody of the younger 2. Things seemed more or less settled at that point, but then in May, Craig filed those papers to hold Laura in contempt of their order. The hearing was coming up, and Laura was at risk of losing the visitation that she did have with the younger 2. But that was not what she had in her plans. She wanted a complete reversal of the custody plan. Laura and PJ decided to move their blended family down to Durham, North Carolina, and Laura wanted to take all of the kids with her. The problem was, she didn't have custody of 2 of them. In spite of that, Laura and PJ signed a lease on June 26th with a move-in date of mid-July, before the hearing for custody. It looked like the initial plan was not to kill Craig, but to win custody back in court before the beginning of the school year. 2 days after signing the lease on June 28th, Laura sent a text to Colin saying that she needed her adult children to step in as witnesses for the 12-year-old so she could get custody and enroll him in school in North Carolina. She said she had done all she could herself. Laura was blaming her custody issues on everyone except herself. It was Craig lying, the kids refusing to speak up, and the state failing them. And now she was putting the responsibility to solve this squarely on Colin's shoulders. A few days before the murder, someone had entered Craig's house and his bedroom, and he believed it was one of his older sons, likely Colin. The question was, how did that fit into the bigger picture of what was going on? Now, taking the house keys and hiding them in a neighbor's planter made some sense. It would have given them access to the house, assuming the neighbor didn't find the keys, which they did. But why would someone pull out an arm hair? Were they going to plant it somewhere? Was that a trial run to see how easy it was to get into his room? How easy it was or hard it was to wake Craig up? Honestly, I find this to be an unclear and unresolved part of the case. But even with that piece a little out of place, in early December 2016, the indictments were handed down. 45-year-old Laura Rideout, her sons, 22-year-old Colin and 19-year-old Alexander Rideout, and her boyfriend, 50-year-old PJ Tucci, were charged with second-degree murder and tampering with evidence, and Laura was also still facing that burglary charge. Prior to trial, there were the usual amount of pretrial motions, and the most controversial one was asking to sever the trials, which the judge denied. All four would go to trial at the same time. Colin's defense did get his statements about helping his mother clean up the bloody basement kicked out. The investigators clearly suspected him at the time that they were recording this conversation and Colin was not free to go, yet they did not caution him about his right to remain silent. Also not allowed in at trial were any accusations of abuse from Craig towards Laura. It was deemed irrelevant since she was not arguing a battered spouse defense. She was arguing that she didn't do it, so if she didn't do it, Craig's alleged abuse was besides the point. And all those texts between Colin and his sisters that were essentially trying to provoke Craig into an abusive tirade were also not allowed in because all they could prove were what phones they were sent from and to. They didn't know who was in possession of the phones at the time. And along those same lines, there was a Google search done 2 days before Craig's murder. It was done on Colin's phone, and the search was for the words involuntary manslaughter. Because they couldn't prove Colin was using the phone at the time of the search, it was not allowed in. So, when this went to trial in the summer of 2017, there were 4 defendants, all with their own defenses. And they were largely pointing the finger at each other, which also meant in addition to defending their clients, some of the defense attorneys were also almost being prosecutors against the others. Colin's side pointed the finger squarely at PJ and Laura, and Colin later said in an interview that he believed his mother had even purposely tried to frame him for this, so that she and PJ could get away scot-free and move to North Carolina with the other children. He said she had him buy that shovel, supposedly to edge the flower beds. She then put the drain cleaner in his cart and left him to purchase it alone, which then made it look like the purchases were his idea. Then she left the shovel at the scene to link him to the crime and then asked his help in cleaning up. He may have been guilty of tampering with evidence, but not with murder. Alex's defense was essentially the same, yes to covering it up, but only at the request of his mother. Laura's defense, however, pointed at Colin and Alex. Laura had only gone to Craig's house that morning because her 2 kids were alone and Craig was missing. She went to the basement and saw the blood, so she did start cleaning it up because she assumed her sons had done something and she was trying to protect them. Laura was too small to have overpowered Craig, according to her side of things, and they also pointed to the murder weapon, that homemade garrote. It was tied with a left-hand bowline knot, something Colin would know how to do thanks to his 2 years at maritime school. Now, Colin's supporters would point out that PJ Tucci was the only one of the 4 who was actually left-handed and was just as likely to know how to have tied that knot. Now, PJ's defense was the one that did not point the finger at anyone else, but rather argued there just wasn't enough evidence to link him to any part of the crime. Of course, the Walmart purchases were a big part of the state's case, but the overall defense strategy was to show that they were normal purchases. The shovel, it had a flat blade. Clearly, Colin didn't think he was going to dig a grave with it. He really did just buy it to edge the flower beds at PJ's house before they sold it prior to the move to North Carolina. And according to Laura and PJ, that explained all of their purchases as well. They needed the drain cleaner to clear out some slow-draining pipes prior to selling the house. The tarp and bungee cords were also used for moving things. There was nothing purchased that they didn't have a reason to buy, and it was just a coincidence that they bought everything within hours of Craig's murder. On July 25th, 2017, the jury returned with the verdicts. PJ Tucci was found not guilty on all charges. Alexander Rideout was found not guilty of murder, but guilty of tampering with evidence. Colin Rideout was found guilty of murder and tampering, and Laura Rideout was found guilty of murder, burglary, and tampering with evidence. PJ Tucci then walked out of the courtroom while the other three were taken away in handcuffs. That's not to say PJ was entirely free, as he lived under a giant cloud of suspicion regarding his involvement, as well as having the police look into the death of his wife, who had died just a month before Laura moved in. The reporting on this then forced his wife's family to issue a statement that she had died of liver disease after a battle with alcoholism, a private family struggle that they didn't intend to make public. As for the verdicts in the case of Craig Rideout, I think the jury's decision as far as the murder charge went came down to the blood evidence. Laura and Colin had a significant amount of Craig's blood on their clothing, with a state's witness testifying that the spatter on the clothing meant they were near Craig when he was struck. PJ's clothes from that night that he was wearing in the Walmart security footage were never found. Alex had some blood on his clothes, but a smaller amount, and nothing that linked him to being at the scene of the murder. As for the tampering charge, PJ was the only one denying involvement in the cover-up, and the few things that connected PJ to any cleanup did have some other explanations. He may have believed the tarp and bungee cords really were for moving, and then Laura used them for a different purpose. Maybe he wore those work gloves on a different day, and that's why his DNA was in them. There were books in his car that had bloodstains on them, but maybe the books had been touched by Laura or one of the boys. There were just too many other explanations, and while it would have been easy for the jury to link him to it, just due to his relationship with Laura, the evidence against each of them just was not equal. At sentencing, Alex was given about 3 to 8 years in prison and was released on parole after 3.5. Laura and Colin got 25 years to life in prison for the murder charges. The tampering charge added an additional 2 years to the minimum sentence, so Colin will be eligible for parole when he is 50. Laura got not just the additional 2 years for the tampering charge, but also 15 for the burglary, and these are to run consecutively. She will have to serve a minimum of 41 years before parole eligibility at the age of 83. Both have appealed and continue to point the finger at the other one, claiming they only helped clean up. As of this recording, all appeals have been denied. Thank you for listening. You can find Crime Lines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crime Lines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crime Lines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.